Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight, we step into a quiet, bewitched valley, where the Hudson River bends wide under dark skies and old shadows still cling to the land. This is Sleepy Hollow, a place suspended between tradition and superstition, a village steeped in mist and myth. Here, the wind hums through walnut groves, and men glance nervously over their shoulders when walking home alone. Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, penned in 1820, is more than just a ghost story. It is an early mirror held up to the American soul. Beneath its humor and hauntings lies a meditation on identity, aspiration, and the uneasy inheritance of a land shaped by both dreams and dread. In this first part, we meet Ichabod Crane, a comically thin schoolmaster with a voracious appetite for food and fantasy. We follow him into the valley where superstition reigns and ambition is easily spooked. As we listen, consider what it means to chase promise through a land still echoing with deep memory. Ichabod's fears of shadows, of failure, of being cast out, are not his alone. They reflect the unease of a young nation eager to rise, yet still shaped by the burdens and mysteries of what came before. In his superstition, his ambition, and his uneasy place among the people of Sleepy Hollow, we glimpse the American spirit, brave, imaginative, and never quite at rest. In this valley, the past does not sleep, it lingers, and sometimes it rides. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, Part 1. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river known by the old Dutch navigators as the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town, or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days, by the goodwives of the adjacent country, due to the stubborn habit of their husbands lingering about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely mention it for the sake of precision and authenticity. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather, a fold of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just enough murmur to lull one to sleep, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever disturbs the steady tranquility. I recall that, when a boy, my first squirrel hunting expedition was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shade one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noon, when all nature is peculiarly still, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness and echoed angrily through the hills. If ever I should wish for a retreat where I might escape the world and its distractions, and dream away the remains of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. Due to the idle peace of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, this secluded glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to fill the very air. Some say the place was bewitched by a high German doctor in the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Whatever the cause, the place remains under some bewitching power that casts a spell over the minds of the people, making them walk in a perpetual daydream. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, subject to trances and visions, and often see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood is rich with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Shooting stars and meteors flash more often across its skies than in any other place, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make this her favorite playground. The ruling spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to command all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a horseman without a head. Some say it is the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was carried off by a cannonball in some forgotten battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is now seen galloping through the gloom of night as if borne on the wind. His haunts are not limited to the valley, but sometimes stretch to the nearby roads, especially near a church not far off. Indeed, certain of the most trustworthy local historians who have carefully gathered and compared the floating accounts about this specter say the trooper was buried in the churchyard, and the ghost rides out nightly to seek his missing head. The wild rush with which he sometimes passes through the hollow like a midnight blast is said to be because he is late and hurrying to return to his grave before daybreak. Such is the gist of this legendary superstition, which has inspired many a wild tale in this shadowy region. The specter is well known at every fireside in the country as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that this dreamy tendency is not limited to the valley's native inhabitants, but is absorbed unconsciously by anyone who stays there for a time. However alert they may have been before entering that drowsy region, they soon fall under its spell, begin to grow fanciful, dream dreams, and see apparitions. Let's take a short break here. Something clings to Sleepy Hollow, not just fog or silence, but something older, a hush that isn't empty, a stillness that listens back. Here in this glen, where stories gather like leaves, the new world and the old seem to walk side by side, not always at peace. The church bell rings, but in the woods something rustles that has no name. Psalm and powwow, hymn and whisper, cross paths like travelers on the same road. Irving does not choose sides, he simply shows us the tangle, how the saints live next door to the shadows, and how even a schoolmaster who sings of Zion can still be afraid to walk home alone. This was America in its earliest morning, born of reason, yet steeped in memory. A land where European faith met native soil, where Puritan ideals brushed against the wild, and where no one yet knew if the future would be ruled by order or by chaos. Let's get back into the story. I mention this peaceful place with all due praise, for it is in such small, hidden Dutch valleys, scattered here and there in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain unchanged, while the great wave of migration and progress that transforms the rest of this restless country flows by them unnoticed. They are like quiet eddies beside a rushing stream, where one may see straw and bubbles quietly circling in their tiny harbor, undisturbed by the current. Though many years have passed since I last walked the drowsy paths of Sleepy Hollow, I would not be surprised to find the same trees and the same families still growing in its sheltered heart. In this secluded spot of nature there lived, some 30 years ago, a worthy fellow by the name of Ichabod Crane, who resided, or, as he put it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow to teach the children of the neighborhood. He was a native of Connecticut, a state that provides the Union with pioneers both of the forest and of the mind, sending out each year its legions of frontier woodcutters and rural school teachers. The surname of Crane was well suited to his appearance. He was tall and extremely lanky, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that seemed to dangle a mile out of his sleeves, and feet that could have served as shovels. His whole frame seemed loosely hung together. His head was small and flat on top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long, hook-like nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched on his spindly neck, turning to show which way the wind blew. To see him striding along a hilltop on a windy day with his clothes flapping around him, one might have mistaken him for the very spirit of famine come to earth, or a scarecrow escaped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely built of logs. The windows were partly glazed and partly patched with pages from old copybooks. It was cleverly secured when vacant with a withy twisted into the door handle and stakes propped against the window shutters. Thus, while a thief could easily get in, he would find it more difficult to get out, a design most likely borrowed from the architect Joost van Houten from the mechanics of an eel trap. The schoolhouse stood in a large, lonely, but pleasant spot just at the foot of a wooded hill, with a brook running nearby and a formidable birch tree growing at one end. From within came the soft murmur of students reciting their lessons, like the hum of a beehive on a drowsy summer day, occasionally broken by the stern voice of the teacher, issuing threats or commands, or perhaps by the dreadful sound of the birch rod as he guided some sluggish scholar along the flowery path of knowledge. To be fair, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's pupils were certainly not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel school tyrants who take pleasure in the pain of their pupils. On the contrary, he administered justice with more discernment than severity, easing the burden for the weak and laying it more heavily on the strong. The frail, timid child who flinched at the mere motion of the rod was often spared, but justice was served by doubling the punishment on some little stubborn, broad-skirted Dutch boy who sulked and swelled with sullen defiance beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never delivered a chastisement without following it with the assurance, comforting in its own particular way to the smarting urchin, that, quote, he would remember it and thank him for it the longest day he had to live. When school hours were done, he was even companion and playmate to the older boys, and on holiday afternoons would walk some of the younger ones home, especially those with pretty sisters or mothers known for well-stocked cupboards. Indeed, it was wise for him to keep in his pupils' good graces. The income from his school was meager, barely enough to provide daily bread, for he was a prodigious eater. And, though lank in frame, he had the expansion capacity of an anaconda. To support himself, he followed a custom common in that region. He boarded and lodged week by week at the homes of the farmers whose children he taught, carrying all his worldly belongings in a cotton handkerchief. Let's take a short break again. Ichabod Crane is a wandering soul in a world that prizes place. His life is mobile, his ambitions lofty, but his roots are thin. He teaches, courts, flatters, and floats, never planting, never staying. In this, he reflects an American type still with us, the one who seeks success without sacrifice, who believes charm and cleverness will win the world. Yet, in a land like Sleepy Hollow, where everything is slow and remembered, such weightlessness becomes a flaw. The unrooted man cannot weather the storm. Now, back to the narrative. To prevent his arrangement from being too burdensome to the modest means of his rural hosts, who often viewed education as an unnecessary expense and schoolmasters as idle hangers-on, he found ways to make himself both useful and agreeable. He helped the farmers with lighter chores, making hay, mending fences, watering horses, herding cows, and chopping wood for winter fires. He also set aside the authority he wielded in his little kingdom, the schoolroom, and became wonderfully mild and obliging. He earned favor with the mothers by doting on the children, especially the youngest, and like the bold lions in fables of old, who magnanimously held the lamb, he would sit with the child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for hours on end. In addition to his school duties, he was the neighborhood singing master, and earned many bright shillings instructing the young folks in psalmody, which is the art of singing parts when singing hymns. It was no small point of pride for him, come Sunday, to stand at the front of the church gallery with a group of selected singers, where in his own mind he outshone even the parson. Certainly his voice rang out above all the rest of the congregation, and there are certain peculiar warbling notes still heard in that church, which, on a still Sunday morning, can echo half a mile across the mill pond, and which are said to be direct descendants of Ichabod Crane's nasal melodies. Thus, by various small contrivances, which is commonly called by hook and by crook, the worthy schoolmaster managed tolerably well, and was thought, by those unacquainted with the demands of mental labor, to lead an easy life. The village schoolmaster is generally a figure of some importance in the social circle of a rural community, viewed as a kind of idle, gentleman-like presence, far more refined in taste and manners than the rough country lads, and second in learning only to the parson, which is a pastor. His appearance at a farmhouse tea table often caused a little stir, prompting the addition of an extra dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or perhaps the special parade of a silver teapot. Ichabod was particularly favored by all the young country women. He cut quite the figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sundays, gathering wild grapes from the vines tangled in the surrounding trees, reciting epitaphs from the tombstones for their amusement, or strolling with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the nearby mill pond, while bashful farm boys looked on from a distance, envying his polished ways. Thanks to his semi-itinerant life, he was something of a traveling newspaper, carrying the latest village gossip from house to house. His arrival was always welcomed with delight. Among the women he was esteemed as a man of great learning, having read several books from cover to cover, and being a master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, a work in which, it must be said, he firmly and fervently believed. He was, in truth, an odd mix of modest cleverness and deep gullibility. His appetite for the marvelous was matched only by his capacity to believe it. No tale was too strange or monstrous for him to swallow. He often took pleasure after school hours in lying on the soft clover bed beside the brook near his schoolhouse, poring over Mr. Mather's frightful stories until the twilight made the page a blur. Then, as he made his way by swamp and stream and dark forest to whichever farmhouse was lodging him that week, every sound in nature stirred his overwrought imagination. The mournful cry of the whippoorwill on the hillside, the foreboding call of the tree-toad, a storm warning, he believed, the eerie hoot of the screech owl, or the sudden rustle of birds disturbed in the brush. The fireflies, too, flashing brightest in the darkest hollows, would now and then startle him, especially when one blazed across his path. And if by chance a clumsy beetle blundered into him mid-flight, he was nearly ready to faint, imagining he'd been struck by a witch's charm. His only remedy in such moments, to distract his thoughts or banish evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes, and the good folk of Sleepy Hollow, sitting by their doors in the evening, would often be filled with awe to hear his nasal melody, quote, in linked sweetness long drawn out, end quote, floating from a distant hill or along the shadowy road. Another of his favorite chilling pastimes was to spend long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives sitting by the fire while apples sizzled on the hearth, listening to their eerie tales of ghosts, goblins, haunted fields, haunted brooks, haunted bridges, and haunted houses, especially of the headless horseman, known as the Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He, in turn, would regale them with his own tales of witchcraft and dire omens from early Connecticut, frightening them with talk of comets and falling stars and the unsettling truth that the earth actually turns on its axis, meaning they spent half their time upside down. There was pleasure in all this, especially while nestled in a warm chamber glowing with the light of a crackling wood fire, where no ghost would dare to show itself. But that comfort was dearly bought with the terror of his walk home afterward. What fearful figures and shadows met his gaze in the dim glare of a snowy night! How anxiously he scanned each flickering light from a distant window across the empty fields! How often he was shocked by a snow-covered shrub that loomed like a ghost in his path! How he trembled at the crunch of his own footsteps on the frozen ground and dreaded to glance behind him lest he find some dreadful creature stalking close. And how often his heart nearly failed at the howl of a sudden wind through the trees, believing it the sound of the Galloping Hessian on one of his spectral rides. All these, however, were merely terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness, and though Ichabod had seen many specters in his time, and had more than once been troubled by Satan in various disguises during his lonely wanderings, daylight banished all such evils. He might have led a pleasant life in spite of the devil and all his works, had his path not been crossed by a being who causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and all the witches in the world put together, namely, a woman. Among the musical disciples who gathered each week to learn psalmody under his instruction was Catharina van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a prosperous Dutch farmer. She was a blooming young woman of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and famed not just for her beauty, but for her considerable inheritance. She was also something of a flirt, as could be seen even in her dress, which mixed old-fashioned and modern styles to best show off her charms. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold that her great-great-grandmother had brought from Saardam, a laced stomacher from earlier days, and, provocatively, a short petticoat that revealed the prettiest foot and ankle in the whole countryside. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart when it came to women, and it's no surprise that such a tempting morsel quickly captivated him, especially after visiting her at her father's estate. Old Baltus Van Tassel, her father, was the very picture of a thriving, contented, generous farmer. True, his thoughts rarely strayed beyond the borders of his land, but within those bounds all was orderly, cheerful, and well provided. He was content with his wealth, not prideful, and prided himself more on plenty than on polish. His home stood on the banks of the Hudson, nestled in one of those fertile, sheltered nooks beloved by Dutch farmers. A great elm tree stretched its broad limbs over the house. At its base bubbled a spring of the sweetest water, flowing from a barrel-formed well, sparkling its way through grass to a nearby brook winding among alders and dwarf willows. Close by the house stood a massive barn, large enough for a church. Every window and crack overflowed with the bounty of the farm. Inside, the flail beating the grain sounded steadily from dawn to dusk. Swallows and martins flitted about the eaves, pigeons sunbathed on the roof, some with one eye skyward as if watching the weather, some with heads tucked under wings or chests, others puffing, cooing, and bowing to their mates. Sleek, oversized hogs grunted in the contented comfort of their pens, from which adventurous piglets occasionally trotted out to sniff the air. A proud flotilla of white geese sailed on the pond, escorting fleets of ducks. Turkeys gobbled across the barnyard, guinea fowl bustled about, shrieking like bad-tempered housewives. Before the barn door strutted the gallant rooster, model husband, warrior, and gentleman, clapping his shining wings, crowing with joy, scratching the dirt, and chivalrously calling his ever-hungry brood to feast on each newly uncovered treat. The schoolmaster's mouth watered at the sight of this sumptuous preview of winter feasting. In his hungry imagination, he saw every piglet already roasted, stuffed with pudding and an apple in its mouth, pigeons neatly tucked into pies beneath golden crusts, geese swimming in rich gravy, ducks paired off on platters like married couples with a respectable dose of onion sauce. The fat hogs became future sides of bacon and juicy hams, the turkeys trussed and ornamented with sausages, and even the bold rooster himself lay on a silver dish, feet in the air, as if begging mercy his proud heart had never asked while alive. As the enchanted Ichabod imagined all of this, his great green eyes roamed over the fat meadows, golden fields of wheat and rye, buckwheat and corn, and orchards heavy with fruit surrounding Van Tassel's warm home. His heart swelled toward the damsel who would inherit all this land, and his imagination leapt even further, converting it all to cash, and then into great tracts of wilderness, with shingled mansions rising in the untamed lands of the West. Already he saw himself triumphant, Katrina surrounded by children, perched atop a wagon piled with household goods, pots and kettles swinging beneath, while he himself rode ahead on a steady mare, with her colt following, bound for Kentucky, Tennessee, or who knew where. Upon entering the farmhouse, Ichabod's infatuation was complete. It was one of those broad, old-fashioned homes with high ridges and gently sloping roofs, built in the style handed down by the early Dutch settlers. A long porch ran along the front, its low eaves forming a kind of outdoor room that could be closed against bad weather. Hanging there were flails, harnesses, fishing nets, and various tools of farm life. Benches lined the walls for summer sitting, a great spinning wheel stood at one end, and a churn at the other, proof of the many domestic uses of that busy space. From this porch, the awestruck Ichabod entered the hall, the heart of the home. Rows of gleaming pewter, which is a kind of metal, lined the long dresser, dazzling his eyes. In one corner sat a great bag of wool ready for spinning. In another, freshly woven, linsey woolsey cloth. Ears of corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in cheerful garlands, mixed with vivid red peppers. A partly open door gave him a glimpse into the best parlor, where claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables gleamed like glass. Andirons with shovel and tongs sparkled among dried asparagus stalks. Mock oranges and conch shells adorned the mantel. Strings of brightly colored birds' eggs hung above it, and from the ceiling dangled a huge ostrich egg. In a corner cupboard, left slightly ajar on purpose, glimmered old silver and carefully mended china. From the moment Ichabod beheld this paradise, his peace of mind was gone. His only thought became how to win the affections of the radiant Katrina Van Tassel. But in his quest, he faced more real difficulties than the knight-errants of old, who merely had to vanquish giants, sorcerers, dragons, and the like, enemies easily dispatched. They merely had to break through walls of iron or brass to reach the damsel's tower, then claim her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the other hand, had to navigate the whims and wiles of a country coquette, which is a young girl, full of shifting moods and baffling caprices, and to do so while contending with a whole host of real-life rivals, sturdy, rustic suitors who guarded every path to her heart, watching each other warily, but quick to unite against any outsider. Let's take another quick break here. Notice, Ichabod's pursuit of Katrina is less a courtship than a conquest. He sees land, wealth, legacy, and immediately begins to build imaginary castles in the untamed West. Irving uses Ichabod's hunger as a subtle caution. When desire eclipses discernment, when imagination inflates ambition, the soul can warp. In a world where men set out to carve empires, what steadies the hand? Without humility or true affection, even love can become just another prize. Let's get back into the story. Among these rivals, the most formidable was a burly, boisterous, swaggering fellow named Abraham, though commonly known by the Dutch abbreviation Brom van Brunt, the hero of the surrounding countryside, which rang with tales of his strength and boldness. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant face, combining mischief and bravado. Because of his powerful frame and physical prowess, he had earned the nickname Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was celebrated for his skill on horseback, riding with the ease and confidence of a Tartar. He led every race and cockfight, and with the natural authority that strength confers in rural life, he often served as the final arbiter in village disputes. Tilting his hat and speaking in a tone that brooked no opposition, he delivered his judgments like a man used to having the last word. Always ready for a brawl or a prank, he had more mischief than malice in his nature, and beneath his overbearing roughness was a generous dose of jovial good humor. He had 3 or 4 close companions who looked up to him as their model, and with whom he roamed the countryside, attending every party, fight, or festival within miles. In cold weather, he was easily recognized by his fur cap adorned with a flaunting fox's tail, and when people at a country gathering saw that cap from afar, darting among a band of wild riders, they braced themselves for trouble. Sometimes his crew could be heard galloping past the farmhouses at midnight, whooping and shouting like the troops of Don Cossacks. The old housewives, jolted from sleep, would listen for a moment until the clamor faded, then murmur, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors viewed him with a blend of awe, admiration, and affection, and when any wild prank or village fracas occurred, they were quick to nod and say Brom Bones was surely behind it. This rowdy gallant had for some time marked the lovely Katrina as the object of his rough courtship, though his romantic gestures were more like a bear's fond embraces than a poet's serenades. It was whispered that she did not altogether reject his advances. Indeed, his appearances were enough to scare off rival suitors, who had no desire to challenge a lion in love. So reliably did his presence announce his intentions that if his horse was seen tied at Van Tassel's fence on a Sunday night, a sign that he was inside sparking, other hopefuls would turn away and seek prospects elsewhere. Such was the formidable opponent Ichabod Crane found himself contending with, and, truth be told, even a bolder man might have hesitated at such a contest, and a wiser one despaired altogether. But Ichabod possessed a peculiar blend of flexibility and persistence. He was like a supple jack, pliant yet unbreakable. Though he bent under the slightest pressure, the moment it passed, snap, he stood straight again, head held high. To challenge Brom Bones openly would have been foolish. Brom was not a man to tolerate interference in his romantic affairs, any more than the fiery Achilles. So Ichabod chose a quieter path. He used his position as singing master to make frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had to worry about interfering parents. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a lenient soul who adored his daughter more than even his beloved pipe. Like a wise and loving father, he let her have her way in all things. His brisk little wife was far too busy with her housekeeping and poultry to concern herself with romance. As she sagely said, Ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. So, while the bustling dame spun at one end of the piazza, and honest Waltz smoked his pipe at the other, watching a little weather-vane soldier atop the Varn valiantly battling the breeze, Ichabod would court Katrina beside the spring under the elm tree, or stroll with her at dusk, that hour so well suited to the lover's voice. I do not claim to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they remain full of mystery and wonder. Some hearts seem to have but one vulnerable point, one path to entry. Others are like castles with 1,000 gates open to conquest from 1,000 angles. It is a feat of cunning to capture the former, but true genius is needed to hold the latter. For a man must guard such a fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 ordinary hearts earns a kind of fame, but he who rules undisputed in the heart of a coquette is truly a hero. That honor, it appears, did not belong to the redoubtable Brom Bones. From the moment Ichabod began his quiet pursuit, Brom's hold on Katrina seemed to slip. His horse was no longer seen tied at the fence on Sunday evenings, and a bitter rivalry took root between him and the schoolmaster of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a kind of rough-edged gallantry, would have preferred to settle the matter like the knights-errant of old, with a duel. But Ichabod knew too well the superior strength of his foe to agree. He had overheard Brom boast that he would, quote, fold up the schoolmaster and shelve him like a book in his own schoolhouse. And Ichabod took care never to give him the chance. This peaceful resistance was maddening to Brom. With no outlet for his aggression, he resorted to rustic mischief. Ichabod became the frequent target of Brom's pranks. His schoolhouse, once a sanctuary, was turned into a haunted place by Brom and his gang. They smoked out his singing school by blocking the chimney. They broke in at night despite the twisted Withian stakes, leaving the place in chaos. The poor schoolmaster began to suspect the witches of that region held their meetings there. Even worse, Brom mocked him in Katrina's presence, training a scoundrel dog to howl in a ridiculous imitation of Ichabod's singing, and presenting the animal as a rival tutor in psalmody. Despite these torments, the contest dragged out without decisive outcome. Then, one fine autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat in reflective mood atop his high stool, the throne from which he governed his little academic kingdom. In his hand he held a fair rule, which is like a yardstick, his scepter of authority. The birch rod of justice rested on 3 nails behind him, a constant threat to evildoers. On the desk lay a collection of confiscated contraband, half-eaten apples, pop guns, spinning toys, fly cages, and legions of handmade paper gamecocks. It seemed some dreadful punishment had recently been carried out, for the students were unusually quiet, hunched over their books or whispering with one eye on the master. A kind of buzzing hush filled the room. Let's take another short break here. In Sleepy Hollow, even love keeps time with the turning of the earth. There's no hurry, no race to the altar. Instead, the days stretch long, courtships drift like wood smoke, and the elm trees nod, having seen it all before. The village lives outside the rush. Its clocks tick softer, its rituals hold fast. And maybe that's what draws us in, the sense that somewhere, life can still be slow and sacred, where gestures matter and silence speaks, where a glance by the spring house means more than a dozen messages. We do long for that sometimes, don't we? In a world always rushing forward, some part of us wants to linger, to remember how to wait, to believe that time, real time, isn't counted in clicks, but in the hush between heartbeats. But even here in Sleepy Hollow, for Ichabod Crane, that pace is about to quicken. Let's move back to the story now. Suddenly, the stillness was broken. A Negro boy wearing a tow cloth jacket and trousers and a battered, round-crowned hat like Mercury's cap came riding up on a ragged, wild-eyed colt, using a rope as a halter. He clattered to the school door and delivered an invitation for Ichabod to attend a merrymaking, a quilting frolic, to be held that evening at Meneer Van Tassel's. Meneer, by the way, is the Dutch word for Mr. He delivered the message with an air of self-importance and elaborate language, as such messengers often do. Then he galloped across the brook and disappeared up the hollow, full of urgency and pride in his errand. All was now bustle and commotion in the once quiet schoolroom. The lessons were rushed through without fuss. The quick students skipped half their work and were not called out for it, while the slower ones received the occasional swat on the rear to hurry them along or help them over a difficult word. Books were tossed aside, inkstands overturned, benches knocked over, and the entire school was dismissed an hour early, bursting forth like a pack of young imps, yelping and tumbling about the green in joyful uproar at their unexpected freedom. The gallant Ichabod now devoted at least an extra half hour to his toilet, brushing and polishing up his best and only suit of threadbare black, and arranging his hair by the aid of a broken bit of mirror that hung in the schoolhouse. To appear before his beloved in the proper manner of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he boarded, a choleric old Dutchman named Hans van Ripper, and thus mounted, he set out like a knight-errant in search of adventure. But it is fitting, in true romantic fashion, to pause and describe the appearance of our hero and his steed. The horse he rode was a broken-down plow horse, whose best days were long behind him, though not his ornery temperament. He was gaunt and shaggy, with a ewe neck and a head like a mallet. His ragged mane and tail were tangled with burrs. One eye was milky and blind, while the other had a wicked glint. Still, there must have been spirit in him once, as suggested by his name, Gunpowder. He had been a favorite mount of the fiery Van Ripper, who was a reckless rider and may have passed some of his own temper into the horse. Despite his appearance, there was more devil in Gunpowder than in many a young spirited colt. Ichabod was well matched to such a steed. He rode with short stirrups that brought his knees nearly up to the saddle horn. His elbows jutted out like a grasshopper's leg. He held his riding switch upright like a scepter, and as the horse jogged forward, the flapping of his arms resembled the wings of a bird in flight. A small wool hat perched on the top of his nose, which, given the lack of forehead, was perhaps the highest point on his head, and the tails of his black coat flapped nearly to the horse's hocks. Such was the spectacle of Ichabod and his mount as they ambled out the gate of Hans van Ripper's farm, a sight as strange and ungainly as one rarely sees even in broad daylight. And that's where we will leave Mr. Crane for now, in pursuit of what exactly? Love? Status? Peace? Sleepy Hollow whispers from the edge of our modern minds, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Beneath its still air and gentle rhythm lies a land where spirits once breathed, some good, some wild, all watching. The settlers may have claimed the valleys, built chapels, named the roads, but in the woods, something older still stirred, a presence not forgotten, only quieted. Ichabod walked between these worlds, crossing thresholds where faith met fear, and where the sacred confronted the strange. His story will end unexpectedly, in unresolved tension, in a place where every oak might have a memory, and every hollow a voice. And so we ask, what else walks beside us, just out of sight? What part of us still hears the whisper in the branches, not just the wind, but the witness? Next time, we will follow Ichabod deeper into the night. The feast ends, the road begins, and Sleepy Hollow shows its teeth as a specter rides out to chase down poor Ichabod. Down the road a few episodes, we'll eventually travel south to a Carolina swamp where something old watches from the reeds, and even later, we'll follow a lonely postman into a desert town that vanished overnight. But before all of that, we'll hear of Ichabod Crane's terrifying final ride. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If these stories have stirred something in you, one of the best ways to support the show is by joining our community on Patreon. At the first tier, you'll receive early access to all episodes, plus 2 exclusive bonus episodes when the season concludes. At the second level, you'll get a special gift in December, a free copy of this season's separate audiobook project, our modernized recording of Washington Irving's Old Christmas. If you're listening to this later on, the second tier benefit would just be the next audiobook project that we're working on. And for our top tier patrons, you'll receive an early edition, signed copy of bound collection of this season's myths, a tangible piece of the world we're building together. Regular listeners will have to wait until these become available for purchase later on. Your support keeps the lantern lit and ensures these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.